Okay, thank you everyone for joining us. My name is Dan Dalton. I'm the Three Rivers Program Manager for PASA, based out of Pittsburgh. I want to thank you all for joining us for our workshop today on developing an effective employee handbook. We are really excited to offer this opportunity. It's in response to a lot of questions that we've had from folks over the last year or so. And I think from the response we've gotten, it's definitely something that people have been looking for. A couple of administrative things. This webinar is going to be recorded and the slides will be made available to you if you request them. You can send any requests to me, dan@pasafarming.org, if you'd like to receive any and all of this for your review. The webinar itself will be made publicly available in about 9 or 10 months, but because you all are paying attendees, you'll get a hold of it obviously now and into the future. Originally, this webinar was scheduled to be presented by Blooming Glen Farm, who are known for their employee handbook. Unfortunately, they were not able to join us. But today, instead, we have myself. I'm going to be presenting on some of the best practices that we've encountered through our work with our diversified vegetable apprenticeship and through work with farms generally. And then I'm going to hand it off to Marlene Van Ness from Trellis Legal, also from Pittsburgh, to speak about some of the other issues and legal considerations that you might want to account for as you develop a handbook. Everyone except for Marlene on this call is muted. So if you do have any trouble hearing us or any other technical issues, but you are on the call otherwise hearing me, please type those in the chat box and let me know that fact. We will be unmuting folks at the end, so I'll be collecting questions through the chat box, and then we will unmute folks at the end of the call if you want to raise your question by voice. Otherwise, we appreciate you joining us, and we'll get started. So an effective employee handbooks, really, we're going to dig into this a little bit, but it's really one part of an overall human resources strategy for managing and administering employment to folks. So it is important to remember that it is worth the investment, but it isn't the end-all be-all for managing people. Let me see here. And our folks, Marlene, did that advance the slide too? Oops. Okay.
Yes, it did.
Sorry. Okay. All right. Thank you. All right, great. So one of the things that we're looking at here is getting the most out of your employee handbook. It's worth considering it on sort of the continuum of the employment spectrum. You want to think about what you're looking at from a sort of a holistic perspective of employment. You want to start with before you're hiring, moving through actually using it in your employment process, and then continuing on and even consider it in the context of the end of employment. So as you're beginning, even before you're getting to hiring, you definitely want to make consideration for recruiting the best candidates possible. It sounds a little bit simple and a little bit obvious, but it is worth putting some investment into that. Still, one of the best ways that folks have been finding successful candidates is through word of mouth or virtual word of mouth. Recently, some of the best recruitment that are aware of have come through folks using their social networks to put opportunities out into the world. And it's not necessarily that the person that you know or that you're reaching through your social networks is the best person, but the people that they know in their extended network. So somebody who's sort of near your social network, but not necessarily of it, is a great way to recruit. Beyond that, referrals from current and former employees, folks who have friends or siblings, the people who know your farm best often know the next group of best people to join you. And then if neither of those are options, or if you want to expand your search further, you have things like the local colleges and universities. We are fortunate to have many here in Pennsylvania, and several of them have farms or intensive gardens that can serve as a jumping off point to join you on your farm. So we have Chatham University, Delaware Valley, Penn State, obviously, Dickinson College, Wilson College, Lafayette, and so on. Those are really a great pool of people who are looking for an experience who'd like to join you. Across Pennsylvania more widely, PASA has our classifieds board where you can post opportunities, and apprentices or potential employees can post that they are interested or seeking out a farm. You can also engage with us via programs like the Diversified Vegetable Apprenticeship, either as a host for an apprentice or for a graduate of that program. And then finally, the ATRA listserv is pretty well known, and Good Food Jobs have a lot of postings. Once you have identified a candidate or two or three that you think are really worthwhile and that you want to engage with for your farm, it is really worth putting a little bit into the interview and vetting process for candidates. I know a lot of times it seems like on the resume that they have all the experience, and maybe even on the phone, that they seem like a good fit, but it is really worth seeing them up close and personal, getting to know them, letting them get to know you. One of the biggest things that has been correlated with success for employees in the vetting process is working interviews. Actually having somebody out to your farm to work for a few hours or a full day, doing the work of the farm, not just a tour, but actually engaging with the work of the day. Pay them just an hourly stipend or consideration for their time, but then use that time to dialogue with them and really get to know them. The second thing that's most well correlated with the successful hire or match of a candidate is to share a meal with them. I know it seems a little bit personal to be doing this from the jump, but it is a really great opportunity to see them in a different context and to discuss some of the broader considerations for a relationship on the farm, some of the things that we'll talk about in a minute. And then calling references, it's a really, it seems very basic and it seems almost like a hassle sometimes, but just to get that little bit of extra reassurance or context can really make the difference for either affirming that you have the right person, or confirming that maybe you have, maybe your reservations are warranted and maybe you should keep considering other candidates. During this whole process, it is really important to set expectations and to share details about the work. You should be sort of starting to get into all of the considerations around compensation, things like wages, housing, leave, benefits, job titles, and potentially future opportunities, so that the person is able to sort of see a future and situate themselves in a sort of continuum of opportunities on your farm. And then discussing work details, talking about typical tasks, expectations for working hours, talking about the schedule of a typical week. You often, obviously every week is a bit different and the season is pretty variable, but talking about maybe a typical spring week in the greenhouse, a typical mid-season week out in the field, and maybe a typical fall week in the pack house or at market or something like that can be really helpful. And then talking about the types of labor that's expected of them. It's worth, again, it's a communication process really is what we're talking about across this whole experience. You want to talk about your standards of efficiency, your expectations about productivity. You can even do during a working interview or early on in the employment process, talk about what your standards are for things like how quickly or how many boxes for a CSA share should be packed in a unit of time. So how many boxes per hour, or how many cases per half hour, something like that. Want to be very sure about communicating working conditions. I know a lot of people often think about those beautiful mornings in the spring and the fall where it's really comfortable and you really want to be outside, but it is worth pointing out things like working conditions in the midsummer, about conditions, in the winter, being, sort of elbow deep in wash water in the early winter, things like that, just to help highlight for folks, the realities and the variability in farming, because that's both the joy and part of the challenge that a lot of people encounter. And then to sort of walk them through what your orientation process is going to look like and the onboarding process. I know some folks are, out in the field on the first day, sometimes the first hour. Other institutions, the larger and the more institutionalized you are, it's often a process of being onboarded and oriented to the farm. So it is worth, again, just communicating and helping to set their expectations around how long is it going to be before I actually hit the field and I'm actually sort of in the dirt for myself. We want to talk about how they're going to be evaluated, talk about methods for how you assess them as a potential future employee, when those evaluations will take place, any opportunities for promotions or raises, potentially, a bonus or a stipend at the end of the year, if that's a possibility, just to let them know, again, sort of what's on the horizon. And then talking about your disciplinary procedures and mechanisms. And then finally, it's worth communicating a good bit about yourself. Obviously, we're not all great at sort of sharing out a lot about ourselves, but you definitely want to help to communicate your farming style and maybe where that comes from. You can talk about your training experiences and how you learned what you know. Talk a little bit about your motivations. Why do you farm? What do you love about it? What do you find challenging about it? And ask them the same. Why do they want to be a farmer? Why do they want to be involved with your farm? And what else are they motivated by? What are they trying to get to? Talk a little bit about if you're able to articulate what your preferred relationship is with them. Are you going to be managing them more seriously, or are they going to be more of a peer? Is it more of a sharing, give and take relationship, or is it a little bit different than that? And then it's really important to talk about your personal communication style. I know a lot of us communicate in one way and don't necessarily share out information in all ways. But if you're sort of a tactile, do-it-yourself, get-in-there learner, and you have somebody who really needs a lot of explanation to understand what they're doing, it is worthwhile to try to understand that ahead of time, so at least you know that about each other. And then finally, talking about goals for the position, both from you as a farmer and for them as an employee. What are you trying to get out of it? During the process, the employment relationship here, like I said, an orientation is crucial. It is really important to help to set their expectations and to let them know where everything is on the farm, both physically and sort of in the process of the day and the week and the season. Some of the labor management best practices, really it's worth considering, if you don't do it already, a daily or a weekly team meeting. And that can be a field walk to go out and scout crops and do a lay of the land. I know some people put together a daily task list and then just do a quick run through with their staff. All of this is about sort of setting expectations and communicating really what is top priority for the day and where does everything else fall after that. Another thing that we're not going to be covering specifically how to write them today, but I will point out that there is some good interaction between an employee handbook and standard operating procedures. Those standard operating procedures are really important for helping to sort of set expectations and let people know what's expected of them.
I actually just want to jump in real quick, Dan. Sure. The standard operating procedures, and I'll get more into this in my section, but it's also great in terms of kind of making sure things are done and making sure things are, kind of done to a standard, to the same standard. That's why they're called standard operating procedures. So outlining those can also make sure that things that you want to have done, and I'll get into why that sometimes helps on liability standpoints, when I get to my section, but standard operating procedures are great both from an expectation standpoint and also from a consistency and legal standpoint.
Great. Yeah, thank you. To both of those points, the daily or weekly meeting and standard operating procedures, it is really worthwhile to have a farm map, a layout of where things are generally. Some people really like to go deep into this and describe sort of the flow of where things are on the farm, how things should move. Other folks just like to have it as a reference. I know a lot of us use that for managing our actual crops in the field. But it is something that is worth doing because it does help just to sort of interact with those standard operating procedures. It helps with the orientation process because now you have a reference point for all of that. And it is worthwhile, and it can be really useful for your team meetings and task lists, especially as your operation may get bigger over time. This is also important to mark out where things like your emergency supplies are. Fire extinguishers, safety data sheets are becoming more of a concern, where they're located. Even restrooms and parking and all of that can be really helpful for orienting a new person and just helping them feel comfortable sooner on the farm. As a part of the onboarding process and orientation process, you want to consider safety trainings. Some of those may be mandatory, some of those may be optional, but it is really worthwhile. Things like OSHA trainings around just basic safety can be really useful, hazard analysis, tractor safety especially. Tractor injuries are really prevalent, and you want to try and avoid those as much as possible, both from a good stewardship standpoint and from a liability standpoint. Be sure to discuss any insurance policies and how they might interact with the employee's employment. Think about, and if there is a way to communicate employee appreciation and recognition. A lot of times as we get bogged down in the middle of the season, it can be really easy to get sort of into a negative headspace, and just try and break that up as much as possible. Consider offering learning opportunities off the farm. This can be farm visits. This can be attendance at workshops or conferences, and even some farms that have a few apprentices or interns or part-time employees or employees generally offer an ongoing series of discussions about farm topics, which can be a really good way to just sort of orient people to the whys and wherefores of your farm. A lot of times new folks on the farm have questions about why is it done this way or that. And if they have a forum to ask and to discuss, that can help save you a lot of headaches as far as explanations in the field. Having good equipment, making sure that things run efficiently and are productive and the equipment starts every time. This is important both from a safety standpoint and from just the best practices. Getting frustrated as an employee with equipment that doesn't work is a really quick route to burnout. And that's really what we want to avoid. We want to have a lot of longevity and a lot of positivity and productivity from our employees. And then working with employees in the field. This can be a really great opportunity to do a lot of that teaching. You can do a lot of modeling about how you want things done, both as far as technique and as far as speed. I've heard from a lot of farmers that when their crew is lagging and slowing down and not really doing things as quickly as they could or should, that one of the fastest ways to jumpstart that is to get out there in the field and show them how it's done, and show them through your own interaction how you want things done and how quickly. It's also an opportunity to communicate informally with them. And it can be a really great forum when you see an issue, when somebody's not having a good day or not having a good week, to get out there and check in with them while still being productive. You don't have to have a formal HR meeting in the office. You can do it out in the field, get a little bit ahead of the group and just talk with them privately, that sort of thing. If it is something that is potentially, a liability or a concern, it is worth documenting as well. But just from a, managing people standpoint, it is worth getting out there and being in the field with your employees. And then finally, exit interviews, making sure that you are gathering as much information from somebody who's leaving the farm as is reasonable for you. making sure that you're getting their feedback, you're hearing any complaints or any concerns that they might have. And this can be in addition to, or it can be solely on its own. It doesn't have to be the reason why they're leaving necessarily, but just any kind of feedback like that can be a source of a lot of opportunities for continual improvement. Okay, so this is why we're all here today. Why write a handbook? I took this from Vern Grubinger, who is a sort of renowned extension agent up in Vermont. And I thought that this sort of laid the ground as well as anything I've seen. A high quality employee handbook makes a statement to your workforce that they are important to the success of your business, and it explains their roles and responsibilities in achieving that success. A good handbook can help you avoid workplace problems while enhancing the productivity of your workforce. Like I said, I think that speaks for itself, but it's really, this is why we're doing this webinar today. So boiling it down, there are a lot of resources out there as far as writing an employee handbook, explaining the whys and wherefores, but in conversation with Marlene and in my own experience, I would say that it really boils down to three things. What is an employee handbook? It's a communication tool. What are you trying to communicate? You're trying to communicate your expectations and your standards. Included within that are roles, responsibilities, metrics of success, as well as setting what should and should not be done, and communicating your farm policies. And then to the final sort of bottom line, it can also be a really strong legal tool, which is some of what Marlene will be discussing in a little bit. Development of a handbook. There are as many ways to develop a handbook as there are farmers with them. It can be a really simple or a really complicated process. I prefer simplicity, and I think as growers and as professionals, I think simplicity is really the place you want to start with. And then you can sort of grow and adapt and change this document over time based on your experience and your needs. I pulled out from my archives several different employee handbooks that I've collected from actual farms over the last few years. And they are all within, I'd say, 2 to 6 pages. I've seen some that are substantially longer, but simplicity is really the order of the day. Yes, so somebody asked if there is a part that will of the handbook that discusses the culture of the organization, and I'll get to that in just a minute here. Yeah. So start simple. Writing a handbook is like doing anything else, and I always analogize it to doing your crop plan. The first draft, the first time, the first year is always the hardest. And with every time you come back to it and every time you update it, it gets easier, it gets better. So just remember that, it is worth investing the time. There are a couple of alternative ways to sort of shortcut and short circuit the process and go a little faster if you need one right away, or you feel like you really want one immediately. Probably the most appropriate is to borrow one from a comparable peer farm. So to reach out to somebody who is of similar size, has similar labor needs to yours, similar equipment, things like that, and ask them if they're willing to share it with you. Everyone that I'm aware of who has been asked has been open in sharing their handbooks with the farmer who's asking. Obviously, we can't expect that, but it is worth asking. It is worth, really considering how appropriate it is to you. But that's a good way to get started if you really want to jumpstart the process. The other way is to use a template from an extension service. A lot of departments at universities and elsewhere, some nonprofits offer employee handbooks. One of those that I would point out is the Sample Employee Manual for a Farm from the organization Farm Commons. They are a nonprofit organization that provides farm-specific legal advice. In this realm.
I'm going to correct you real quick, Dan. They don't provide legal advice. Actually, they're not allowed to. They just provide legal resources and templates.
That's right. Sorry, I knew I was going to get that wrong, and I did. Yes, resources to refer to, and this is a nice several-page template to sort of work off of with some handy short pointers and ideas that you could consider. I put an asterisk next to both of those alternatives because there is no shortcut for doing the meaningful work of articulating your own expectations and needs on your farm. I think a lot of times, like business planning, you can import a business plan to yourself, but that doesn't mean that it reflects what you're doing, and it doesn't mean that it meets your needs now or in the future. So it is really worth if you're going to use one of these methods for borrowing or using a template to make sure that you're spending extra time engaging with all of the needs and expectations that you're trying to articulate.
One other thing I want to add on that is just, if you are borrowing or using kind of a general template, make sure and I'll talk through some of these things today. For if you're in Pennsylvania, there are some state-specific employment laws, and you want to make sure that your handbook's consistent with it. So, obviously as an attorney, I'm always going to advocate, like, it's great to do a draft yourself and use templates and work off of them. They're such a great tool, but it might be worth having an attorney look it over, or just making sure you're familiar with the state-specific laws, whether you're in Pennsylvania or not, to make sure that there's nothing in that template that isn't inconsistent with your state, or that might hinder anything in your case because your state interprets something differently.
Yes. So after reviewing the Farm Commons document and numerous other employee handbooks and resources from around, including a lot from PASA farmers, these were the common elements that come up time and time again in most handbooks most of the time. And we're going to break each of these down as we go along. But, essentially an introduction to the farm, discussions of things like your management style and farming policies. Personnel policies are a huge part of it. Like we said already, expectations are huge. Terms of employment, potentially, vacation, personal time, sick time, benefits that are offered, if any, disciplinary procedures and policies, conflict resolution, and legal statements, including statements around non-discrimination. So getting into this a little bit, the employee introduction to the handbook. You want to lay out the purpose of the handbook to acquaint employees to the farm, a little bit about your size and scale, your history, anything you want to be uniformly communicated to people who are joining you in the business as employees, general policies and rules. You want to talk about benefits and privileges. If you have a mission statement, which I encourage folks to consider, just laying out your core mission for the organization, please include it here. A little bit of history about the farm and a description, and this can be fairly loose because these things are always changing, but a description about your products and markets if you want to share that out. In a discussion about your management style, you want to describe the farm's organization as a business. This is mostly along the lines of for-profit or nonprofit designation. But if you do have unique, if you're operating as a cooperative, or if you have some sort of intergenerational management, or again, something else about the management that you want to share out with incoming employees, here's a good place to do it. It's worth articulating who are the owners, because it's not always obvious. Especially for somebody who's just coming onto the farm. It is worth considering space to designate who the employee's direct supervisor is, who they should be communicating with, and that will come in a little bit later as well. List who's in charge of different aspects of the farm. So if you have a field manager, a production manager, a retail manager, wholesale, things like that, giving a little bit of description of the lay of the land as far as the current employees and their roles. Some more general farm information. These would be for anything that applies to, oops, sorry, I have a question here. Would we include specific contacts in the earlier section, phone numbers, emails, etc., for managers? I think it depends a little bit on your operation, and you definitely could consider it. It's just that it's worth remembering that anything you include in the employee handbook, you want to keep updated. So if you're expecting, if there's a lot of turnover in those roles, or you just don't want to be engaging with printing out new handbooks too often, you might want to have another place where that resides. But if you feel like it's fairly stable, or you just want to use this as the place to communicate that, I think you could do that here as well. It's a little bit of a personal decision, but yeah. General farm information includes things that apply to everyone on the farm. So any general rules and a lot of the lay of the land sort of aspects of things. You want to talk about the location of emergency medical information, supplies, and an eye wash station. If you have a smoking or non-smoking policy, you could articulate that here. If you have a designated smoking area, where is that? Details about a food safety plan, that anything that all employees are required to read and follow in that plan can be included in this section. How you want sanitation and safety issues addressed, any requirements around footwear, like closed-toed footwear, things like that, or other personal protective equipment. Hand washing prior to food for retail sale, observing posted warning signs, and locations of things like your public restrooms, telephone, fire alarms, and extinguishers. You can imagine where several of these things would interact really nicely with a farm map, like I was discussing previously. And some of these, like the food safety plans and the hand washing, obviously interact with aspects of your farm that are going to reside in other plans or be other parts of the operation. So this is not the end-all be-all of your general information, but again, think about this as the framing lens. This is the opportunity to share general farm information with all of your employees uniformly. And it really comes down to those baseline concerns. Personnel policies are the thing that I think a lot of us mostly focus on when we're thinking about an employee handbook, and it tends to be the core of most employee handbooks. This is your opportunity to describe things like work hours, daily or weekly scheduling, days off, break times, and how long those breaks are, overtime policies and work, compensation issues, and how work is recorded or calculated. That would be your timesheet, things like that. When is the timesheet due, for example? Why and when pay may increase, what that might be tied to, what your pay period is, and how payroll deductions might be broken out, especially if if you have any unusual deductions or any other considerations that you want to share out. How employee performance can be linked between raises or bonuses. So is it a end of season bonus where you have to stay for the entirety of the season? Is it just a percentage of the annual profits, something like that? All of those can be recorded here. Question was raised, is agriculture exempt from overtime pay? Marlene, do you want to take that one?
Sure. Favorite lawyer answer, it depends. We could do a whole nother webinar on employee pay and exemptions. But basically, for certain agricultural labor activities, there are some exemptions to overtime pay. But there are conditions on that. So I would recommend you look at Farm Commons has put out some great resources on their website, farmcommons.org, on understanding ag employment and some of those exemptions. And then also, I think Penn State's Law Center has put out some stuff in regards to Pennsylvania's rules. Sorry about that. So I recommend checking those out. And I think also we might be doing a workshop on some of those things later in March. But I would definitely check out the Farm Commons research, and then also as resources, as well as some of the Penn State resources.
Great, thank you. Again, so covering things like employee performance and how it's linked to raises and bonuses. This can also interact with things like your probationary period and how it relates to wages and hours being increased. And if you have sort of a scaffold of responsibility, you can articulate that here. I know some folks in the PASA community likes to orient and onboard people, and then once it's apparent that you are a fit for their system, they rapidly increase your responsibilities and hours and so on. If that's the case, or something like that is the case for you, this is probably a good place where you want to articulate that and think through it so you can share it out with your employees as they're coming on board. And then to include here, and definitely I strongly encourage people to consider employee performance evaluations. It's not always appropriate to have their direct supervisor doing that evaluation. Sometimes it's worth having peers do that, or having some sort of higher level manager be involved in that process, because there are sometimes some dynamics between folks interpersonally. This can be a great opportunity to give feedback and mold performance and improve performance over time, and also to receive feedback back to the farm management about the position. Okay, so for many years ago, I don't remember who it was that told me this, but the quote has always stuck with me, that violated expectations ruin lives. That when you you set expectations and violate them, that people can get very disgruntled very quickly, and it becomes sort of a downward spiral of just negative thoughts on their part, and they just end up sort of leading to burnout. On the flip side, if you don't set expectations, people kind of just come in with whatever notions they have, and they sort of sit with them. So it is really worthwhile thinking through what your expectations are of them, to try and get feedback on what their expectations are of you, to lay that all out here in the employee handbook, and then to try and hold each other accountable for those expectations. So first and foremost, for any employees, what are my work hours? A lot of times with setting those daily and weekly task lists, it's also worth setting a target for when you want the workday to end. Obviously, circumstances change, the weather changes, things take longer, things break, and so on. But it is worth trying to have a target for each day or for each task, for when am I going to be done working, and what am I going to have to get through to be done. It can be really powerful for folks to have a task list for the day. The employees really are killing it, and they finish all the tasks on the list early. Let them go home early. There's always more to be done on the farm, but we can take that as a lesson for setting more realistic expectations about what can get done in a day. And we can also just give them the good feeling of going home early in the middle of a hot summer day and letting them enjoy their free time and a job well done. Some other things you want to communicate here are a little more technical and a little more practical. Where are they supposed to park? Where would they wash? Where are the bathrooms? Where would they eat meals? Or if they're going to prepare meals, where can that happen? Where should they take breaks, and where can they take breaks? If smoking is permitted, you probably have it restricted to some area. Where is that? I know a lot of folks especially are concerned about tobacco mosaic virus being transmitted to tomatoes. So you probably, if you are allowing smoking, want to consider mandatory hand washing after a smoke break. Making calls, what does that look like? I know some people have parents who are working on the farm, so they have to be available should their kids have any problems. Do you make a special, make consideration for that? You probably don't want somebody just taking just general purpose calls in the middle of the day. So what is your policy? I sort of broke out a whole separate bullet point here for cell phones specifically, and all of the attendant things that you can do with a cell phone, including listening to music, texting, and all of that. I've heard a lot of people talking about earbud farmers lately, folks who have their earbuds in and are focusing on whatever they're listening to as they're getting through the day. I think that can be really powerful for somebody who is aware of what they should be doing, is doing things safely, and is doing it at an appropriate pace. But for a lot of new employees especially, that can be tough. Some people disallow any and all of this, and it's worth considering before you have an issue in the field. Again, required clothing, this can be a safety issue as well as a comfort issue. Do you provide or do you suggest folks bring for themselves closed-toed shoes, long-sleeved shirts, sunscreen, hats, and so on? If you provide it, you want to sort of lay out what they can expect and then make sure that you obviously are providing what you said you will provide. If you are allowing, especially a new employee, to use farm equipment or farm vehicles, you want to set some standards around that. You can just make a general statement about safe operation, but if you are going to let them be using this early on, you want to orient them to each machine. A lot of our older tractors have some quirks to them. You want to make sure that they're aware of any rollover bars, any seat belts, any issues with controls that might exist. Because this can be both a liability and a safety issue, as well as just being a general operating concern. If you're applying any materials, whether they be organic or not, pesticides are pesticides, fertilizer is fertilizer, make sure that folks know who is allowed to apply them, how they are expected to apply them, what the appropriate use of equipment is, and what personal protective equipment is available. The worker protection standard does apply to organic producers as well as conventional growers. So make sure that you're familiar with that and are providing the correct and appropriate equipment. And then how are employees expected to present themselves in front of customers? I know some of us, some farms will just send out the most gregarious and social employees. Some require that everyone engage with markets or distribution. And if that's the case, you want to set a standard of professionalism, positivity, and make sure that they're actually reinforcing in a positive way your brand to your customers and outlets. And then just to sort of bookend this whole conversation about expectations, what happens when these things go wrong? What happens when I'm late? Who do I call? How do we remediate that? How do you want to deal with that? Some people have a hard start time. Some folks have a rolling start time. Just think through your system and how you want to interact with those sort of questions going forward. Vacation, personal time, sick time, and so on. Under what circumstances, if any, is an employee eligible for paid leave? That's a little bit more of a technical question. Who should the employees call to report to if they're absent or tardy? Again, going back to the previous question. How much notice would you prefer to be given in anticipation of any or all of these? Somebody taking a vacation in the middle of July or August is going to be pretty tough on an operation, but maybe you can or want to plan around that. When is the last you would need to know for that sort of thing to happen? And maybe you just aren't able to offer that in the middle of the heat of the season. And what should employees expect regarding the end of the season? I know some people do sort of a phased shutdown for the winter, starting in October or November. Some people go to the end of the year and then take a break around New Year's. Again, this is about setting expectations for the timing and the duration of of those winter breaks so that folks are able to anticipate and plan accordingly well ahead of time. Another key concern obviously is benefits, but I would sort of point out the when do I get paid question. I know we all just sort of assume that, well, the checks are going to come, but when do they come and how do they come to us? There's a significant difference between being paid once a month, bi-weekly, and every week. So make sure you spell that out. Are your employees eligible for any insurance? And you want to be sure to communicate any laws that the employees are covered by as far as compensation, and make sure that, for workers' compensation, and make sure that all of their paperwork is filled out appropriately by a supervisor. One of the other things that comes into play a lot within the smaller farm community is just offering free food. You know, sometimes it's seconds and calls, sometimes it is just, you know, a share of the CSA or something like that. If you're going to provide that in a consistent way, you can spell that out and make sure that that's a part of your discussion. If it's more informal, you can say this is an informal offering that we have on the farm. I know some farms offer discounts or bulk buys from some of their suppliers. If that's something you offer, just lay that out. And then this is probably the other key concern, you know, when do I get paid? How much do I get paid? And what will stop me from being paid? You know, what will get me fired? You want to list the actions and grounds for disciplinary action, any steps or tiers that might take, and articulate what your termination of employment expectations are. This is a list that I took from Vern Grubinger, but just a list of behaviors that are expressly prohibited. You know, impairment of any kind on the job, especially when you're considering using equipment, should be expressly disallowed. Theft and harassment, fighting, intentional damage of equipment, possession of weapons, disregard for safety, and insubordination. Obviously, I mean, these are all pretty straightforward, but one of the things that a lot of the authorities are concerned about right now is safety, and the other is harassment. So make sure that those are things that you do not countenance on your farm. If you do have a lower level conflict or disciplinary issue, you want to articulate what your conflict resolution policy is. You want to consider if it's between lower employees below the manager, or if it is between a supervisor and a lower level employee. How should your new employees report these things out? To whom should they report it? And how will that be remediated? And then if they do have a grievance with some sort of policy or practice that's going on the farm, what options are available to them? So there's a question about employees who are on livestock farms taking photos that might potentially make the farm look bad. Marlene, do you have anything on that?
Yeah, so I would say you can have a policy about, and I actually have written this into a couple handbooks, is kind of a social media and or just general media policy. So you can even be as strict as saying no pictures on the farm, just because unfortunately a lot of times things can be used and portrayed in a negative light or incorrectly. But also, like I've written into policies before that, you know, you cannot basically write bad things about the company you work for on social media or other forms of media, and you can't post. So you could, so you can actually have policies that strictly forbid that. You know, there's other types of legal claims you could always bring against someone, but it might be good to basically, if you're concerned about that, you can put into your policy handbook that pictures should not be taken on the farm.
I think it's also going back to some of the best practices from earlier on as a part of your orientation process and your handbook. Like you say, to explain to folks what's what on the farm and how they evolved to what they are today, and sort of your rationale for things, especially for folks who are new to farming and are interested in it but aren't necessarily very experienced or versed in it. Some things that are pretty typical on farms can look concerning to them. And so it is worth, like I say, just orienting and communicating about the whys and wherefores and the rationale for what happens on your particular farm. That can help to short circuit a lot of issues. Okay, so I'm going to pass it over to Marlene for some additional legal considerations that are worth including in handbooks or worth thinking about.
Yeah, so Dan covered all these really great points, and I guess I'll introduce myself real quick. I'm Marlene Van Ness. I'm the principal attorney and founder of Trellis Legal LLC. It's a law practice out of Pittsburgh, but I serve kind of all of Pennsylvania. I'm licensed in Pennsylvania. I do everything from, I specialize in business transactional law, so everything from setting up a business to contracts to employment agreements, leases, things like that, business contracts, purchase contracts. But I have a background in agriculture, and so I have a specialized practice kind of in the areas of food and agriculture. So I luckily get to work with PASA a lot in that capacity. And so, my job today is to kind of help kind of take all those great points that are just part of the day-to-day operations and things that you should include, and also be aware of some of the legal implications, as well as some of the rules in Pennsylvania. And if you are tuning in not from Pennsylvania, a lot of these different states will have policies on these, so you should familiarize yourself with those or talk to an attorney in your state. But yeah, the goal is to I'm going to talk about kind of what at-will status means and the role that handbooks can play in that, as well as some of the topics that Dan covered just a little more in depth from a legal perspective. Next slide. So what does at-will? Some of you might have heard this term before, but it basically means that an employer can terminate an employee at any time for any reason, except for an illegal reason, and for no reason without incurring legal liability. So basically, without incurring a claim for wrongful termination. But likewise, an employee is free to leave a job at any time. So basically what it means, under Pennsylvania law, we are an at-will state. So that basically means that unless you have an agreement that states otherwise, you can fire an employee for any reason at any time, and they can leave at any time. Because basically, there's a real benefit for you not to be able to terminate them at any time without any reason, because if you do have set reasons, and they believe you haven't followed those, then you open yourself up to wrongful termination suits, which can have obviously cost and legal ramifications. But then the balance is that they can leave as well. So the default in Pennsylvania is that without some other agreement, an employee is at will. However, and just having a handbook doesn't negate that. However, it's important to make sure your handbook is worded correctly and that none of the policies in there do combat that. So one thing that is really important is to make sure to state in the employee handbook that the handbook is, if you're in Pennsylvania, that it does not affect the at-will employment. And usually how I do that is put it in a kind of upfront introduction. It's kind of a disclaimer. Typically what we do is, you have the kind of table of contents, and then the next page is kind of welcome to our farm. Here's what we're about, kind of talking about the ethos and what to general expect. And then kind of at the bottom of that saying, it's also important that you understand that this does not affect the at-will status of your employment, and this book is meant to educate you solely on the policies and procedures of the company, but that does not affect that status. So that's important. And then I also usually have, which I'll get into at the end, a signature page, which reaffirms that they understand that. But then it's also important that throughout the handbook that you don't state super limiting circumstances in which a full employee can be fired. So you can say, if you are found to be drunk on the job, this will likely result in just immediate disciplinary action or likely result in firing. But you don't want to say like, these are the set circumstances in which you can be fired, or these are the only circumstances in which you can be fired. Or if you set out disciplinary procedures that don't involve the ability to be fired right away, that can also negate that. So it's important because it's not going to be the end all be all, but if an employee who has signed an employment handbook that has procedures like that wants to try to make a claim, they could introduce the handbook as saying, this basically negated that will. So that sounds scary, but really it's just about like crafting things in a way that doesn't make them the end all be all and say, this is generally, procedures, and this, well, you can be fired at any time. This action will definitely result in your firing or definitely result in a disciplinary action. That includes firing. And that's what I also say too, is that if you want to say, if you're found to be drunk on the job, this will likely result in a disciplinary action, which can include termination. So just making sure you're wording everything in the book in a way that doesn't necessarily directly challenge the at-will status of the employee. And you don't want to have to require, and we'll get into a minute about an employee wanting to leave, but you don't want to have to put anywhere in there that you have to give people notice when you fire them, because that is a pretty surefire way to make sure to challenge the at-will status of your ability to terminate an employee at any time. So you just put in there, basically, you have the right to terminate the employee at any time. Next slide. So what does that mean then for your employees and their right to leave? So like I said, at-will does allow for the ability then of your employees to leave at any time. However, you can basically request and come up with a policy standard. Because again, as Dan said, a lot of this is about communication and making sure you're on the same page. So if an employee thinks they have to give 2 weeks and are either hopefully leaving on good terms or something, that they have to give 2-week notice. There's not much you can do if they don't, unfortunately, because that's, at will is a give and take. So you have to kind of balance the fact that things are at will and the fact that, ultimately someone can leave without any notice. But, that's why I recommend at least putting in there the policies for resignation, because that also means that if they don't follow that or it's really bad terms, then, they're not going to get a recommendation from you in the future. So kind of establishing the procedure you want them to follow and equally applying it is a good way to at least combat some of that fact that it can really mess up with your kind of employment planning, especially if someone tries to leave in the middle of the season. Next slide. So Dan kind of touched on this a little bit, and like I said, unfortunately, we don't have time to go through all the employment laws that apply on farms today, but be aware of what employment laws apply to you. The Fair Labor and Standards Act, it's kind of a vague term. It's basically if you have over a certain amount of income, or you are involved in quote unquote interstate commerce, but how the courts have defined that is very, very broad, that basically, unless you're only selling to immediate customers within your state and never outside the state, it's very hard to make that argument that that you're not involved in interstate commerce. So I always, tell my clients by default assume the Fair Labor and Standards Act laws apply to you. However, the American Affordability or Care Act, Affordable Care Act, there we go, the Family Medical Leave Act, and other employment laws typically are only triggered when you have 50 or more employees, which isn't a lot of small farms, but there are additional ones that come into play over that. There are laws relating to breastfeeding and when you have to provide reasonable accommodation for that, which is usually covered under the Fair Labor and Standards Act. So just being aware what employment laws might apply to you. And that's why I kind of said, if you're working off a template, it's a great place to start, but you might want to make sure that you're still aware if there's anything different that applies to you and your farm and based on your size or location. Same thing with breaks. So in Pennsylvania, you only have to supply breaks to minors if they're working on the farm. Full-time overage employees or of age employees or older do not have to have breaks. I mean, obviously, as Dan talked about, you probably want to have them as part of maintaining a good relationship between you and your employees. But just making sure you understand all that is important. And the other thing why it's important, Dan touched on having sexual harassment policy, things like that, is those are where a lot of the potential legal claims happen. And if you don't have a policy that applies to everyone and a standard policy, it can really come back to bite you. So, the FLSA requires equal opportunity policy. So make sure you have a statement regarding that in your handbook, that basically you're an equal opportunity employer, you do not discriminate. Have a sexual harassment policy. So, this has been a hot button issue, especially recently, in terms of how employers handle sexual harassment claims, and employers can be liable for not properly investigating and taking appropriate measures. So, and especially when you're sometimes in a situation where a manager's not always present, if someone's working out in a backfield or everyone's kind of split up, you might not see what happens. It's good to have a policy that says what happens if someone reports an incident of sexual or other harassment. Who do they report it to, and what procedures are taken after that? So, do they report it to a manager? Do they report it to the owner? Do you have an interview process of other people who were present? How much time do you have before you have to update the person who claimed it? So having those kind of procedures are really important. As Dan mentioned, having a policy on substance abuse, so both for a kind of practical, from a crop production standpoint, because there can be issues with that, but also from a safety standpoint for both other people who are on the farm and also if they're working with equipment, as Dan mentioned. And just outline those reporting procedures. I think Dan talked about this too, but for anything where there could be a potential issue, from anything from harassment to even injuries, what is the procedure when someone gets injured? Who do they report it to? Do they report it to manager? Do they manage the owner? They report it to the person who they're working with that day? What does that procedure look like? And do you take any other actions? Do they fill out an injury sheet where they explain what happens? Because sometimes it's good to have a recording at the time of its occurrence. And then you might want to think about additional policies or requirement if you have an agritourism business, and also if children are present. So you might want to think about what your vetting and behavior standard procedures are if you have employees on an agritourism farm where children are going to be on the farm. So thinking about, do you want to do background checks and things like that. Also with agritourism, having procedures that lay out what an employee does if an incident happens with a customer or someone on the farm for an agritourism event. So accounting for that as well. And the biggest thing legally, I always say, is make sure you're equally applying these policies. If you basically have a policy that you only apply sometimes, or you don't follow to a T every time, or you kind of just take a lackadaisical approach on and say, oh, I'll follow it, but I don't want to, this doesn't seem like that big of a deal. Those, not only is it good from a legal standpoint, but also from like a good employee relationship. Your employees want to see you equally applying things. They don't want to see why they were reprimanded for something, or they had to follow a certain procedure and a coworker didn't. So both from a kind of happy employees, happy employer side of things, from a legal side of things, it's important as well. Next slide. So benefits. So again, this is somewhat affected by what laws apply to you, but you, as Dan mentioned, you want to lay out what benefits and if you offer any vacation and if you offer paid or unpaid. So you want to make it clear whether you don't. Right now, Pennsylvania does not require any paid vacation time for employees, but you can always offer that as a benefit. But you want to make it clear either way. And you always want to have, with any of your policies, I also say, you want to kind of have a disclaimer that says you have the right to change these policies in case, either your budget gets tighter and you can't offer the same type of benefits, or things change, or the scale of your operation changes. So I always say having, as a lawyer, I love disclaimers. Having disclaimers and things is a good way to make sure that everyone's on the same page at like, look, this could change. And then also I think it's always good to have a procedure for asking for time off. So for one of my clients, we wrote, that they typically ask for as much notice as possible. So 30 days if they want time off. That might not always be feasible, but you might want to establish, is it 2 weeks? How much notice do they have to give you to ask for time off? Now, obviously, this is a policy that's you can be a little more flexible with, because obviously the way I typically write these is, you have to request time off at least 2 weeks ahead of time. Any requests within 2 weeks will be considered on a case-by-case basis. So that does give you the ability to have some discretion there, while also letting people know that you have discretion, which is a good way to make sure why people understand something might not be equally applied. But this is a good way to manage to make sure not all your employees are taking the same amount of time off at the same time. You also could even have it seasonally different. So you might say during the summer months and from June through September, we really ask that people only take a maximum of 5 days off, and we ask 2 weeks notice, and that you coordinate with another employee to cover that time, or something like that, or make sure that no employee, work with your fellow employees to determine if anyone else is taking time off. So you can, and then saying, in the winter, if you are still having employees, you can make it a little more flexible, but just detail those out. And again, not only does it help you legally, but it helps avoid disgruntled employees and confusion. And that is always actually the best legal protection, because if your employees are happy and they respect you and respect your policies, then they're less likely to want to sue you. Next slide. And Dan kind of touched this when someone asked a question, but, I've seen employee handbooks. I think there's a real balance between, not having enough information and enough coverage for yourself in an employee handbook, and having too much. So my kind of stance on this is anything that's specific to an operating procedure. So how you want planting to be done, how a particular way you handle milking procedures, or a certain way, if you have an agritourism business, a certain checklist that you have that people do before you have customers arrive for the farm that day. That stuff doesn't typically belong in an employee handbook, just because it kind of crowds out some of that important things, because people are always going to kind of peruse these. And so you want to make sure that they're really getting that important information about when, how they report their hours, when they're paid, what are the policies, like harassment policies, things like that. And procedures and checklists should really just be kind of issued to the employees that they affect, or have a separate book of procedures and checklists. The other reason I say that too is that a handbook is usually something, unless you really are changing an important policy, it can get you into trouble if you don't update it regularly, but you're changing your policies or changing your procedures. So usually things like certain operating procedures or checklists are more likely to get changed more frequently than a lot of the other terms of the handbook. So that's why I also recommend that if you kind of keep those separate, you can change those a little easier than having to change or reprint employee handbooks. Another thing, which actually Dan made me think of, is you might, if you don't want your employee handbook being made public, you might want to add a confidentiality policy saying that the contents of this employee handbook cannot be shared with anybody outside of the company or employees of the company. If you aren't comfortable with other farms or other people or your employees showing the handbook to, outside individuals and things like that, or, especially if you're outlining some of your procedures or ones you've developed that are almost kind of proprietary to you and don't want other people to know, you can add a clause about that. You should also address, and Dan mentioned this, like if you have any trial periods for work, and again, that's something where you want to make sure you're not affecting the at-will status. But like, for example, if you say, once you're hired, new hires will be placed on a 3-week trial period. You can be fired at any time, but typically at the end of this 3-week period, we'll have a meeting and discuss your full-time employment. So it still doesn't affect the at-will status, but it also kind of puts people on notice that you're very much still in a trial period. And as Dan said, that also might address if they're paid a little lower during that trial period or less hours or things like that. But again, just be careful on that language that it doesn't say like only after that 3-week period can you be fired. Because I'm sure you're all familiar with working in ag. A lot of people start ag jobs and don't always last that long. 3 weeks can be a long time in the ag world, unfortunately. And again, you also want to have in the handbook, because as you grow as a farm or you change your business, you might have to develop new policies or change some of your policies. So make sure you mention that in the handbook that they have to abide by all current and future policies. Or if you come up with something outside the handbook, that also helps to cover those other operating procedures and checklists and things that you develop outside the handbook, but that it says in the handbook you have to abide by those as part of their responsibilities under the company, under the farm. Next slide, please. Sorry, I just saw we have, how does a trial period, sorry, I just thought we got a question. How does a trial period affect unemployment benefit status and eligibility? I'm not 100% sure, but I would guess that it probably doesn't, because I would have to double check on that. I'm not super familiar, but my guess is once they're basically brought on as an employee, there's usually you could say certain benefits they would get wouldn't kick in, but under the law, I'm pretty sure as soon as someone's an employee, they have to be covered by workers' compensation and certain unemployment benefits. And so I'd have to look at the specific reasons again that when unemployment can apply. But typically, from what I understand, trial periods are more just of a understanding and get to know you phase, and typically doesn't have many other legal abilities to not have to comply with those requirements. Yeah, and one thing to be aware of is like that's where optional benefits you always have discretion over, but non-optional benefits typically is not. But I would recommend either looking into that, looking at Farm Commons resources, or if you want to reach out to me personally, we could look into that for you. And so lastly, one of the really good considerations is have a signature page, at the end of the book that summarizes the scope of the handbook, your right to update the handbook and make changes, which we talked about, remind them of the at-will status, and have employees sign it and date it. Because employees might try to claim that they were never given, if they broke a procedure or something happened or they're being disciplined and claiming, even not just for legal claims, because of the at-will, or they might say, well, I didn't know I was still at-will. Anything they basically try to claim they didn't know because they didn't, they weren't given the employee handbook. If you have them sign and date that they read it, or maybe they skimmed it, and they're trying to claim they didn't know it was in there, well, they have to having them sign a signature page that says, I have read and understand the policies and procedures and requirements detailed in this handbook, and I understand I'm at will, and I understand that you can change this, and sign and date that really helps give you a good argument that they can claim that. Next slide. That might be it. Yeah, so we left a lot of time for questions just because I know there's a lot. Again, really specific employment questions is not really the scope of today, but like I said, I'm happy to point you to more Farm Commons resources, play around on their website, or if you have specific questions for me for your farm that involve giving specific legal advice, you can email me. My email is right on there and we could engage. But if you kind of have other general questions about best practices for handbooks, I know it's a lot of information to try to sift through of how do I make this still approachable, but also make sure I'm covering myself. And that's where kind of a lot of those examples and finding templates and samples that Dan mentioned is a great way to kind of just wrap your head around it. And that's, like I said, where Farm Commons can be great as well. But if you have any kind of general questions about that, we'd be happy to answer them.
Yeah, so a couple things before we open it up for questions here. I just wanted to remind everyone that this session was recorded, so if you would like a copy of the recording for your reference, please email me at the email address here, dan@pasafarming.org, and we will share that out with you. we will be sharing out by email a link to an evaluation for this session. So we appreciate feedback. We use it for grant reporting as well as for improvement of our programs in the future. And there is a chance on there to list any topics that you would like to see addressed in future webinars or future workshops. So please do, if you have something that's sort of stuck in the back of your mind that you'd like to see, please do let us know about that. And then in looking through my my folder here of employee handbooks that have been shared with me over the years, I will say that by far the best one that I see here is only 3 pages of content long, and the fourth page is just for signatures and acknowledging receipt of the handbook and review of the handbook. So just to reiterate what Marlene was saying at the end there. That you know, that really helps to shore up the ground, and that you shared it out with them. What I'd like to do first is I'd like to take questions from the chat box first, and then we'll go to voice questions after that. So if you do have any questions to share by text in the chat box, please do enter them now. And we'll take a few of those. Like Marlene said, any questions that are really specific to your farm, we may not be able to take, but if they are broadly applicable, we'd be happy to answer them. Yeah. So there's a question here about sharing out a list of example handbooks that we find particularly helpful. I would say, for me, from a general standpoint, the handbooks that I have here were shared with me sort of confidentially from farmers, but the Farm Commons resource is where I would start and would recommend you to that, and that is free. Are there any other text questions through the chat group here? Give it another minute. Okay, I'm going to go over to the phones. Please only please mute yourselves from your computer unless you're asking a question, because there's a possibility that this could get quite loud. So if you wouldn't mind muting on your end, and then if you have a question, we'll take it. We did have 2 questions that were raised here. How important is it to have a lawyer look over a handbook?
Yeah, so I mean, it's really up to you, and it's kind of based on how familiar you feel with the laws that apply to you. So if after reading resources put out by Farm Commons or by Penn State, which I saw was another question, and I just kind of said, I know the Penn State Ag Law Center has put out some resources on employment laws that apply to farmers. I don't have an exact citation. Sorry, but if you look through there, they should have some resources. So basically, it's up to you. I mean, I think you want to be aware of what laws apply to you and make sure that your book is complying with them. But it's at the same time, you know, if you familiarize yourself with resources, read some examples, familiarize yourself with the law. So it's really just how comfortable you feel with the understanding of what applies to you. You know, PASA has put out other good resources on this, or, you know, has put out resources like this and have people you can talk to as well about some of these things. So it's really just a balancing game of how comfortable you feel versus the money you're spending on an attorney.
The question here about the sample employee handbook on Farm Commons, what I will do is make sure that we include the link to that directly with the evaluation email that goes out this afternoon. So if you aren't able to find that resource right now, it will be included in the email you'll get with an evaluation. Any other chat box questions? Okay, I'm going to open up the voice option here. Like I said, please do mute yourself unless you're asking a question. But let's give that a shot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Same. I would.
That is.
All classify your.
No. That actually, those numbers are from 2012.
Hello.
Yep. Any questions?
Mm-hmm. Is every Yeah, so I think maybe by the end of this year we will have update version
Sounds like someone's on a
of
phone
that
call. Mute
survey,
them.
but yeah.
Oop. Okay. Well, all right. Any last questions? I guess we'll have to be through the chat box. If folks don't have any questions, we want to thank you for joining us today. And like I said, please do be in touch with any questions or any information or resources you're looking for, anything we can share with you. I want to thank Marlene for joining us on the call here today and for sharing out some of her expertise. And we appreciate everyone's participation, and we hope you have a good afternoon. So thank you all so much.
Thanks, everyone.